Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of our Magnum OPUS Podcast. Today we're going to talk about famous composers, and in particular the one who actually composed our intro and outro music that we've been using for every single podcast episode. That is right, we are going to talk about the Red Priest, Antonio Lucio Vivaldi. Antonio Vivaldi, if you have not heard of him, he is probably one of the composers that you start to study once you enter middle school or early high school. He was an Italian Baroque composer. And remember, when we had our brief conversation about the musical time periods, the Baroque time period was from about 1600 until 1750. And this is just a general consensus that music historians have come to. And usually, in the Baroque era, we see music that is, and art that is a little bit different. Baroque was actually originally used as a little bit of a criticism for the art period that popped up in the 1600s. Little bit about history for you. In the Baroque art, this includes all of European art, not just music, there are 5 major characteristics: motion, space, time, dramatic use of light, and theatricality. So it's a little bit of cool stuff for you if you any art history buffs out there that want to do a little bit more digging. The Baroque era was a lot of interesting sculptures, and there's also a lot of experimentation. So the music in the Baroque time period can be sometimes described as a little bit crunchy if you want to think about tones that don't always go well together. There's a little bit more experimentation. So Vivaldi. Antonio Vivaldi was born in 1678 and he died in 1741. So he lived quite a long time for back in the day when healthcare was not a universal concept, and a lot more people died from smaller ailments and smaller symptoms that were commonly treated today. Vivaldi was one of 6 children born to his parents, Giovanni Battista Vivaldi and then Camilla Cariccio. I love these Italian names. And his dad, Giovanni, was actually a barber, someone he cuts hair for a living, before he became a professional violinist. And then his dad likely taught Antonio Vivaldi how to play the violin. And then they went on touring Venice together, making a living playing the violin. So he had kind of an extensive upbringing in the world of music. Not necessarily from 2 performers. Remember, his dad was a barber, but then his dad learned violin quite quickly, and then he was able to teach his son, and they toured together. Now, Vivaldi's music is oftentimes he was regarded as one of the greatest Baroque composers, and his music had such influence that during his lifetime, it was widespread all across Europe. And if you think about this time period, why was it so important that, first off, he was famous? It's really, really hard when you don't have common infrastructure. They didn't have trains back then. They didn't have cars, let alone internet or cell phone service. So for people all across Europe to know who Antonio Vivaldi was, that means that, first of all, his compositions were famous enough that people liked them in Venice, but then they also traveled. His music would spread to other cities, other performers would play the pieces, and for his name to be known all across Europe 300 years ago, it's a pretty big testament to how famous he was. And Antonio Vivaldi's music actually inspired Johann Sebastian Bach, who was arguably Germany's most famous Baroque composer. Johann Sebastian Bach lived a little bit later than Antonio Vivaldi did. Johann Sebastian Bach died in the year 1750, but it was actually Antonio Vivaldi's works, some of his works, that really kind of were paramount in the development of Johann Sebastian's instrument music. So fun fact there for you. Now, in the year 1703, so Antonio would be about 25 years old, he became Maestro di Violin, or Master of Violin, at an orphanage called the Pio Ospedale della Pietra, which was a devout hospital of mercy. So this was a orphanage, essentially. and he composed. It was an all-girls orphanage, and his most famous compositions came when he was writing music specifically for these young women who he was teaching how to play violin, teaching all about music. And he pretty much stayed there for the next 30 years. Most of his major works that we consider incredibly famous, he composed while working there. And there were a couple other similar institutions, and essentially their purpose throughout Venice was to give shelter and education to young children who were abandoned or orphans, or whose families could not support them. Now, the boys in the orphanage learned a specific trade and actually left the orphanage when they were 15. But the girls received a musical education, and the most talented among them stayed and became members of the Ospedale's renowned orchestra and choir. This is where Antonio Vivaldi picked up the nickname the Red Priest, because of his fiery, flamey red hair, and because he was working at this Saint Devout Hospital of Mercy at this orphanage here. And he became a very, very famous conductor working for these conductor and composer for this orchestra and for this choir. And in fact, many of his most famous works he composed for this orchestra, but not all of his most famous works. So in 18th century Venice, opera was the most popular form of musical entertainment. And it makes sense. Operas are like early world movies or TV shows. They tell us grandiose story that if you're not really liking your life right now, you can kind of slip into this fantasy world just for a little while. And it was actually Vivaldi's most profitable form of compositions. There were quite a few theaters competing for the public's attention, and Vivaldi started his career as an opera composer kind of as a sideline. He was mostly the conductor for the orphanage, but his first opera didn't actually garner a whole lot of success. It took him quite a few tries and a couple of years before his operas really kind of saw critical acclaim and people started to want to go see them. However, it is right about this time in 1717 or 1718 that his arguably most famous composition, The Four Seasons, was commissioned. So right about this time, he was offered a prestigious new position at Maestro de Cappella of the court of Prince Philip, or governor of Mantua, in the northwest of Italy. So he's moved up in the world, he's just kind of composed and gained fame and renown, and now he is court composer for a prince. And then he continued to produce a couple operas for a few years, but it was really The Four Seasons, which was 4 violin concertos that gave musical expression to the seasons of the year, that brought him incredible renown. They were pretty much a revolution in musical conception. Vivaldi represents flowing creeks and singing birds and specifically characterized barking dogs and buzzing mosquitoes and crying shepherds and storms and dances and nights and hunting parties for hunters in the praise point of view. He presents a whole year's worth of memories and changing seasons into one amazingly well done piece of music, or 4 separate concertos, I should say. The one that we always listen to is from Spring. It's the intro and the outro to our podcast here, and if it's something that you enjoy, check out the entire thing. It's about 45 minutes long, and every single one is completely different, and there's multiple different subsections, so if you don't want to listen to the entire thing, you can just do little bits at a time. But Spring is characterized, like we said earlier, with flowing creeks, there's bubbling waters, and if you really close your eyes and just imagine that you can picture spring very clearly, and there's summer storms, and then there's autumn changing leaves, and then of course winter is perhaps a little bit more reserved and it's just a little bit less, but you can still hear that life is coming later on. So this was really, it had not been attempted before, something that was so lifelike to really just bring it into a piece of music. So that's one of the big reasons that we remember Antonio Vivaldi. Not only was he incredibly prolific and he had an incredible choir and orchestra, and he had that fiery red hair that was oh so unforgettable as well, but use this time now to try to pay attention, see if you can hear those birds that he was trying to emulate. See if you can see those flowers popping out of the ground. See if you can just hear spring encapsulated in a piece of music. Thank you, everyone, as always, so much for listening, and I will see you next time. Enjoy.